Episode of the Leaders of Transformation podcast, the number one show for business leaders and entrepreneurs who want to create a greater impact in the world. Every week, I interview amazing guests on this show who are making a difference either in their local community or sometimes nationally, sometimes even the world at large. And today we have the pleasure of a wonderful guest who is Yonason Goldson. And let's try that again. Our guest today is
Yonason.
Yonason. I should have checked that beforehand.
Yeah, I know.
So our guest today is Yonason Goldson, Director of Ethical Imperatives, LLC. He works with leaders to create a culture of ethics that builds trust, sparks initiative, and drives productivity. He is a keynote speaker and a TEDx speaker, trainer, coach, and community rabbi, as well as a podcast host, columnist, and author, a repentant hitchhiker, world traveler, and retired high school teacher in St. Louis. You know, that's a lot. He's got a lot that's been going on. He's learned a lot. He's got a tremendous amount of wisdom that he's going to be sharing today. Our topic is ethical leadership. What does it mean to exercise ethical leadership in today's complex world? He is actually, he's published hundreds of articles applying ancient rabbinic wisdom to the challenges of modern secular world. And he's written 6 books, which his most recent book is called Grappling with the Gray. And I highly, highly recommend this book. There's so much wisdom in this. And what I love about it is that it's not just a theoretical approach, but that he actually has case study after case study after case study in here. What would you do in this situation? Here's what I would do. And so it's very, very practical. So again, Yonason, welcome. We're glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure. And I've reached a point in life where grappling with the gray takes on a number of different meanings. So,
yes, you and me both. You and me both. My hairstylist is trying to prevent that from happening, but I'm all good, because I earned every single one of these gray hairs. So bring it on. We have a mutual friend who introduced us. And so I just want to do a shout out for Evan Money. He is a dear friend, known him for a number of years, and he always recommends amazing guests. And so when he recommended you, I was definitely interested. And of course, when he started talking about your topic, ethical leadership, I was even more interested because today we have, I believe, a crisis in leadership as it relates to ethics and morality. And, you've studied this, so I'm looking forward to getting into it. Now, before I do that, I often forget, and sometimes people even ask me and they say, what do you do for a living, Nicole? You're a podcaster, but what other things do you do? So clearly I'm not as explicit as I think I am sometimes. And so I guess I do podcasts, but I also coach and train leaders to become better leaders. And so if you are looking for coaching, if you are even looking for consulting, maybe working with your team, obviously we're going to be talking today and I'm going to make some recommendations in terms of Yonason. Did I say that right?
You did. Perfect.
Okay, good. I want to make sure I pronounce your name right. For his consulting and what he does as well, you can also go to the leadersofttransformation.com. The website, and there is a page on there for coaching, and it talks about some of the coaching that I provide. And if that's of interest to you, you can schedule a VIP consult with me and we can talk about that further. So with that out of the way, let's talk about ethics. So how do you define ethics? Let's start there.
That is a critical question. There was a psychologist, Raymond Baumhart, who asked professionals how they would define ethics. And he got a variety of answers. Some said it was their religious beliefs. Some said it was what society accepts. Some said it was following the law. And my favorite of all is, I don't know what that word means. And therein lies the problem. If we don't have a working definition, whether as individuals or as a society, how can we possibly be ethical? So the formulation I've come up with is to think of ethics as a discipline. The discipline of recognizing and taking responsibility for the impact our actions have on others and the world we live in. And, we live in a society, we've become so focused, so fixated on our rights that if you're worried about your rights and I'm worried about my rights, we're going to be bumping into each other. We're going to be knocking heads all the time. But if I'm taking responsibility for your rights and you're taking responsibility for my rights, then there's going to be an automatic synthesis, an automatic alignment. We are going to get along. And so recognizing that all of our choices, all of our actions do affect the world we live in. Even things we do in private affect the world we live in because they affect us. And then the ripples go out from there. So it's developing a mindset. I like to say there's no app for being ethical. You can't just punch in the variables into your phone or into your computer, push a button and expect an answer, because situations change. People are different. Circumstances vary. It's not that the principles of ethics change, but the circumstances to which we apply them change. And most of the time, ethical questions are not black and white, which is why I call my book Grappling with the Gray, because we live in those gray areas and we have to prioritize. Sometimes it's a choice between good and good or bad and bad. And we have to make those decisions. So cultivating the mindset that helps us see the whole picture, see issues from both sides, and consider the different weight of priorities and the consequences, all of that wraps up into the mindset that guides ethical behavior, which is the first step towards developing ethical leadership.
So I love that. The fact that you're actually focusing in on this and really diving into what is it not. And I love what you said there about sometimes it is a matter of making a decision between not just good or bad, but sometimes it's bad or worse. And you've got to make those tough decisions. And you have some of those case studies in your book, which are, as I was reading through it, I was like, oh, what would I do in that situation? And it's tough. And then you unpack it and it gives more perspective. And then, of course, you share what actually happened in reality and what was the consequence of that. And I think that's really, really important. Now, as we're talking about this, if you're listening and first of all, we want to thank you for listening and for watching. I forgot to thank you in the beginning. And we just love having these conversations. And one of the reasons why I record it and make it live is so that you can participate, you can benefit from these conversations. And also, like, if you've got a question, please post it in the chat and we'll make sure that we pose it to our guest today. And so you can get the expert response. So again, if you have a question, post in the chat. Also, we'd love to hear where you're dialing in from. You know what? And I say dialing, that dates me. Oh my goodness. But where you're tuning in from, we have listeners for this podcast in over 140 countries. So I know there's people that could be coming from all over the world tuning in. And that's why this topic is so important. This is not just a US based issue. This is not just a North American based issue. Certainly we see how prevalent it is here and how important ethical leadership is here, but this is a global conversation. And so, as we talk about that, I would love to hear, where's from a backstory standpoint, just to give us a little bit more context, what caused you to be so passionate about this particular topic that you are literally, of all the topics you could talk about, this is the one that you really honed in on?
Well, that sort of makes up the subject of my TED Talk, but I'll try to give you the 60-second thumbnail. I graduated from the University of California with a degree in English. And what does one do with a degree in English? I don't necessarily recommend you do what I did, but I took my degree and went hitchhiking cross country for half a year. Then I crossed the Atlantic, went backpacking across Europe until 1 year later I ended up in Israel. And that's where I connected with my Jewish roots. And I was really astonished to discover this vibrant culture of deep thought and spiritual direction. And I ended up spending 9 years in Israel. I studied, I became a rabbi, I met my wife, had our first 2 children. And then I embarked on my teaching career. I wanted to impart to high school students the wisdom and the insights that I had found to guide me through life. And when I retired from teaching in 2016, I wanted to take the universal principles that Judaism teaches and put them in a presentation that would be relevant for modern day professionals. And when I tried to distill all that wisdom down into a soundbite, what I came up with was ethical leadership. Because it's not enough to follow the law. It's too easy to find loopholes. It's too easy to relinquish moral responsibility. This is the problem with compliance. Yeah, we need compliance laws, but ethics begins where compliance ends. And if we try to relegate the decision-making of ethical issues to a set of rules, then we completely miss the point. When we do that, then compliance becomes the enemy of ethics. And we're back to that issue of trying to have compliance becomes the app. It becomes the solution. I'm in compliance. I no longer have to take responsibility for my actions. And now I'm not working to preserve, to maintain, and to strengthen that mindset that's going to govern my actions in all of my relationships. Because ultimately, ethics is about trust. Trust is about relationships. And relationships are what drive success in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, you think about, I think about what's happening in the world right now and the importance of not just compliance, but understanding why you're doing it. And when you were just saying that, I was thinking, when you have rules and you say this is the way it's done, it kind of reminds me of like school. When I was growing up, I learned how to read and write and all that, and I learned by phonetics, right? How to pronounce certain words and all of that. And it was years later where somebody was telling me, oh, schools are getting back to phonetics again. And I hadn't had kids. So I thought, what are you talking about? Wasn't that always the way it was done? And apparently it had flipped and gone to this whole memory-based thing. So the problem with that, of course, is you can memorize or you can be in compliant in this one area. But what about this other scenario? And you can't predict all of the scenarios that you're going to be faced with, or that your people are going to be faced with. And so while compliance is important, if you teach people how to think and how to operate in a certain way that is in integrity, within ethics and ethical boundaries or whatever, then they can actually apply that to anything. And that's why, as I said, with your book, I keep plugging it because I think this is like, I've read a lot of books and I've had a lot of guests on this show who send me their books. This one really stuck out as a book that is so practical and so versatile, because you talk about business scenarios, you talk about even education scenarios, you talk about the headliner, some of the things, the stories we've heard in the news and the backstory of that. And like I said, you can't predict all of the things that are going to happen. Now, I do want to dive. Yes, go ahead. What's that?
Is that I've helped found an organization called the Cotel Business Community, which is a group of professionals devoted to committing ourselves to raising our ethical standards. So that should be a advantage in our business lives. And we meet every Wednesday, and I facilitate an hour discussion of grappling with the grave, these ethical scenarios. Now, I thought that I had thought all these scenarios through and that I'd covered all the angles. And what's been fascinating to me is how in the discussion of a group, all kinds of new insights and angles arise that I hadn't considered when I was writing it. And so part of what ethics requires from us is conversation with people who have different points of view. And so much talk about diversity. Diversity is not just about checking boxes. It's about having different viewpoints represented, different outlooks represented. Because if you have enough people from different perspectives, the answer is almost always going to be in the room. Or at the very least, you're going to come away with a much more comprehensive and a much more objective perspective on whatever your subject is, which is going to help you deal with those uncertainties and those gray areas.
Well, and perfect timing, because I actually want to dive into this on a deeper level. We've been talking about it conceptually and the benefits and the importance of it and so forth. But let's talk about something like rationality. Okay, so how does that hinder us from seeing the truth And we look at the world right now, there's a lot of people that are like really divided, especially in this country where we see this. We're very divided in their opinions, but that's global as well. It's just maybe more right in our face here, where at least I live, and I see that. And so, yeah, talk about rationality in the context of current events.
Well, there are a couple of ways you could go with that. Um, there's a book called The Black Swan. I think it was Nisan Taleb, I think was the author. Um, and he talks about how if we think we have all the information, then we have a confidence that maybe is not justified. If I have not, there was a time when they thought that, the planets moved in a certain way. There was a time when they had all sorts of assumptions about the natural world that subsequently were proven not to be the case. I like to say when I was in grammar school, and then this may not be exactly right, but as I remember it, when I was in grammar school, the universe was 8 billion years old. And then when I was in high school, it was 20 billion years old. And then when I was in college, it was 12 billion years old. And then it was 15, and now it's 13.8 billion years old. Well, the truth is we really don't know how old it is. Science is constantly reevaluating its assumptions. But the point is that if I think I have all the facts, then what the rational conclusion I come to may be consistent with those facts, but may still be wrong because I don't have essential information. And the other problem with rationality is that it can easily become rationalization. And rationalization means that I use rational thought to justify conclusions that I've already reached. And that is, when I give my keynotes, rationalization is the first enemy of ethics. Because as human beings, we have an almost unlimited capacity to rationalize, to find the justifications for the things that we want to justify. And what we have to be willing to do, and when you asked about contemporary issues and modern problems, conservative philosophy and liberal philosophy are not in contradiction with each other. They are they're really two sides of the same coin. Conservatism is a respect for tradition and history as a foundation. Progressive liberalism, or even what was once called progressivism, is the idea of looking forward. How can we improve? How can we develop? How can we move forward? And there's no reason why those should be in conflict. But now people use labels; they have no idea what they mean. They're simply attached to political identity labels, and people don't really know what those mean. People can't tell you what their parties represent anymore. And as long as you have these two ideologies that are having conversations, each one's keeping the other one in check. Each one's providing a counterweight to the other one. And we talk to each other and we debate our issues and we find some form of balance or common ground, then the system works. But what's happening today is nobody wants to talk to anyone except those people who think exactly like they do. And so we've slipped into this tribalism. We've indulged this groupthink. I'm right. Anybody who thinks otherwise is wrong. Nobody's allowed to have a dissenting opinion. Nobody's allowed to ask questions that challenge the status quo. And so we become more and more calcified in our thinking, more entrenched in our ideologies, more eager to vilify people who don't think like us. And we all see the system's not working. We all agree we've got some serious problems and we're not doing a very good job dealing with them. We have to be willing, individually and collectively, to reclaim that dialogue, that respect for other people, even when we disagree with them, that willingness to entertain points of view that we may not be completely comfortable with, and to engage in principled compromise, because we live in a pluralistic society and we can't all have everything. It just won't work. And this model in politics, if we let it, it will slip into our business lives, into our professional lives, into our corporate and company culture. And then we're really in trouble, because no organization can thrive or maybe even survive if there isn't a willingness to engage with new ideas, challenge old ideas, and work together to create a bigger and a clearer picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would do a shout out to Audrey, who's been watching. She said, yes, very true, to this conversation. This is really hitting home. I think that this is the real, like I say, this is the real issue that we're dealing with right now, is that like you said, there's two camps, and you've got I'm right and you're wrong. That right wrong conversation. What you're suggesting is that there is an either or. There's actually a third option, and so, or maybe multiple options. I don't know. Maybe there's a myriad of options. So how do we resolve this? Okay, so we know the issues there. I mean, it's pretty blatant. You go on social media and you're either in one camp, you're kind of in one camp, or you're in the other camp, or you're somewhere in the middle, confused and not sure which way to go. And I'm not just talking, I mean, about it's just in general, like you'll see that, but especially it's blatantly in our face right now. So how do we get those camps together when the system itself is actually designed to polarize?
Yeah, and that's a big issue. The system is rigged against us in the algorithms that social media use to drive us to the extremes, in the entrenched power structures that are more concerned with retaining loyalty than with finding genuine solutions. And it's very frightening to take a stand against your own tribe, against conventional wisdom, when you have good reason to believe that you'll be ostracized for doing so. So there's a culture of fear. Fear is actually the second enemy of ethics. This culture of fear that it makes us feel like we're helpless, like we can't really do anything about it. I used to have a column for the local paper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and my editor said to me once, you're the only moderate I know who doesn't sound like you're wishy-washy or flaky. Because moderation doesn't mean that I just find the middle and plant my flag there. Moderation means that I moderate my style of speaking. I moderate my style of thinking. I'm willing to engage with people coming from different points of view. You go back a couple of thousand years, and there were two great institutions of Jewish learning. And they had very different perspectives on Jewish law, Jewish philosophy. And history records that when they would debate in the study hall, they were so passionate, it was as if they fought with swords and spears. But when they left the study hall, they were friends. They got on. They married the sons and daughters to each other. It was never personal. And even though they rarely came to a meeting of minds, we continue to study their debates and their discussions to this day. And the majority dictated practical Jewish law. But when those laws were recorded, the majority always recorded the minority opinion, and they always recorded the minority opinion first. Because only when I understand the other side can I fully understand my side.
Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah.
That, because you address it in your book as well, that if you have two ideas presented to you and there's one idea that is presented first, it tends to be the one that you're more influenced by and stay with versus the second one. So what you're talking about is you actually pointed out that the minority was actually minority view was put first, so that because most likely majority is going to be in their camp already, and so it's like trying to change that. So talk about that dynamic and how we can use that today.
Yeah, it's when I saw a study a while back, not so much a study, but a thesis that, as we're living longer, and my mother's turning 93 this month, God willing, um, and still pretty sharp.
It's
But
awesome.
as we get older, our minds are more subject to dementia, to Alzheimer's, to deterioration. And so all kinds of ideas about how to keep ourselves sharp, drive a different way to work, do crossword puzzles, do Sudoku, learn another language. But the best way they suggest is to talk to people you disagree with.
So make it a point to do that, actually. Go out and
Seek
look for
out
that.
people who,
Yes.
if you're conservative, talk to liberals. If you're liberal, talk to conservatives. Because what it does is it forces you, assuming you keep it civil, which you should, it forces you to actually hear other people out, to hear a different point of view. Then, when the other person expresses their point of view, say it back. And that has two effects. One, I don't really understand anything until I articulate it. And two, it demonstrates to the other person that I've heard them. It builds trust. Now they may be willing to pay a little more attention to me and hear my side of the story, hear my opinion. When we engage in that back and forth, when we take other points of view seriously, we may discover that there really is some legitimacy to the other side. And every once in a while, you know what? We might even discover we've been wrong. And is that so terrible? I love to quote my college professor who said, I don't understand why people complain about being disillusioned. I would like to be relieved of my illusions. But we've come to a point where most of us would rather persist in being wrong than actually learn what it means to be right. And we have to get out of that ego trap. We have to develop what I like to call intellectual integrity, which means seeing both sides, rejecting double standards, being consistent, and accepting truth wherever we find it, even if it's truth we don't like or a truth we don't want to hear.
Yeah. So recently, I had a friend that said to me, like, I'm an intelligent person, and I've done my research, and just in saying that, I had to make an effort not to be offended because the implication was that I had not done mine, right? And a lot of times we use these subtleties and we don't do them. Not always. Some people do them to be attacking, but she wasn't meaning it that way. But we really do. We get into our camp. I know I do it for myself. I don't actually like being wrong, but I do like that when you said disillusioned. I like to be relieved of my illusions. That's good. But I don't necessarily like to be wrong, but I do like to learn. I'd like to find the truth. For me, I think one of the things was, in certain different situations, you see that there's, it's like they say, there's a saying, right? There's two stories and somewhere in the middle is the truth. And you see that there's these two obvious points of view and you can debate all day long, but I look at it and saying, like, I just want to know the truth, even like with some current events. And we're not naming them, what they are, right? All the stuff that's going on out there. And honestly, my intention and my goal is I just want to know what the truth is. Now, the truth is hard to find sometimes because of the agendas and because of the narrative and all that stuff. And so whether it be one side or the other, there's these narratives going on. And so what you're talking about is so important. It's important in business. It's important in politics. It's important in our family life. I mean, I think about relationships at home, I've been in sales for many years. In sales, you get objections, right? And you don't argue with the person. That's not going to help you get the sale, right? When you disagree with your prospect. It doesn't work really well. And yet at the same time, sometimes your prospect might say something that is actually inaccurate or untrue, right? Or that you don't agree with. And it doesn't mean that you need to agree. And so I'd love for you to talk about this, the difference between acknowledgement and agreement. Because sometimes I think people are afraid to actually entertain and have that conversation because they're afraid that by having that conversation, they're going to have to agree with the other person's point of view, which they don't want to change their point of view, versus acknowledgement, which is we can all do that without giving up our point of view, if you will.
Yeah. And there's really a lot there. I was watching an interview online the other day, and one of the figures in this interview, it was really it amounted to a debate, and one party was using these cheap rhetorical tricks of sarcasm and smirking, and they're really good ways to score points with an audience. But it does nothing to advance the issue. And in the course of what he was doing, he was misrepresenting the other person in a way that was fairly blatant. And the mediator actually called him on it, and it didn't slow him down for a second. He just kept resorting to these rhetorical tricks. What do we want to do? Do we want to win? Or do we want to discover reality? As you said, do you want to get to the truth? When the Jewish High Court would rule on capital cases a couple thousand years ago, you had to have 23 judges in a capital case, and you needed a supermajority to convict. And the bar was very, very high. But if the court agreed unanimously that the defendant was guilty, they let him go. Because if there was nobody on the court, no judge could find a basis for arguing for innocence, they suspected their own intellectual integrity. They were worried about their own unconscious bias.
Wow.
And they said, better we let an almost certainly guilty person go free than risk that we've missed something because there wasn't sufficient debate to really get to every possible angle on the case. And
wow.
French philosopher, what's his name, Joseph Joubert, I think, he said it's better to debate an issue without settling it than to settle it without debating it. We have to be willing to engage in civil discourse, in constructive disagreement, and that's the phrase I love. Back to your point, we can disagree, and we can disagree passionately. But if I can recognize that your position is coming from a place of intellectual integrity, then I can continue to respect you, even though I may not agree with your point of view.
Interesting. I think about if we were to actually operate that way, what a different world we would live in just by applying that one principle, and I think about, not just our court system, but just in general, we believe. It's interesting because you talk about ancient wisdom and the Bible. There's been arguments to say, well, there's some inconsistencies from the stories, and that makes it invalid. And in fact, there is argument, and scholars say that no, it's actually the inconsistencies that actually prove the accuracy, because if everybody is saying exactly the same thing in exactly the same words, then probably it's been doctored or influenced, sanitized in some way. And so it's just a different perspective on it. Now we're talking about ethics as well. And you talked about some barriers to ethics. And I don't know if there's some more that you want to unpack that I think would be useful, that you think it would be useful for this conversation. And also like some of these case studies, it's like we get ourselves into scenarios. So we've been talking about debating and different points of view, but there's also these scenarios that you talk about in the book that we come up with these moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas. And how do we navigate through those when it's not about having a conversation with someone else and seeing a different point of view? It's about making a decision in that moment. And as a leader, somebody that maybe they're doing it in secret, they're making that decision behind closed doors and nobody else is going to know about it, but they've got to make the decision. What are some of the the guideposts to be able to make good decisions in that moment?
I think the first and maybe the most important rule is always suspect your own self-interest. Whatever decision I want to make, that's the one to fight against. There's a cartoon I saw years ago of the CEO is saying to his assistant, "I hate yes men. Don't you agree, Perkins?"
That's funny.
The best leaders surround themselves with people who have different points of view. I mean, everyone should. You want a book on leadership? Read Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln. That he won the Republican nomination for president. He was the big underdog. And he immediately invited all of his opponents into his cabinet. And his advisor said, "You can't do that. They're going to overshadow you. They're going to take control away from you." And he understood that's the way you build a team, is you get people who are not all on the same page. You may have these same guiding principles. You need that. We can't be at odds about where we want to end up. But if we have different views of how to get there, but we all want to get to the same point, I mean, we're going to discover why one approach is better than another, what the flaws are. The differences between us are what's going to make a great team. I mean, you want to make a good football team. You don't clone Tom Brady and put him in 11 different positions. You need one quarterback. You need a team of different players with different skills, different positions. That's how teams succeed. That's how partnerships work. People bring different skills, different abilities, different perspectives. They want the same goals, but their differences make them stronger. And so we have to be willing, again, go back to the sages. When the sages would debate points of law, legislation, you had a high court of 71 sages. And whenever they had to debate a point, the first person to speak was the most junior member. And then the next most junior member and the next. Why? Because if you start with the head of the court, everybody's going to be intimidated. Who wants to argue with the head of the court? But if you start with the junior member, well, the next guy's senior to him. He's not going to be afraid to express a different opinion. But what makes it work is that the head of the court, the senior members, they don't register approval or disapproval. Keep a stone face. Don't try to cue people about which way you want this discussion to go, but sit back and let the different voices be heard. And then you'll be in a position where you can make a rational, informed decision, because you've been presented with all the different perspectives. Doesn't mean we're going to get it right 100% of the time, but we're going to get right a lot more. And we're going to avoid a lot of avoidable mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think about the boardroom and I think about some of the conversations that happen around the boardroom tables in businesses. And I think about the opportunity that you're presenting to invite people in. And I remember that story about Abraham Lincoln. I haven't read that book, so I will pick that up. But I remember that story about how he made all his rivals his cabinet. And it is a wise leader that invites differing opinions, differing perspectives. And you mentioned in the beginning about even diversity. You know, there's a lot of talk about diversity in terms of right now, in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, and all of that. But diversity goes way deeper than that. It's actually diversity of thought is what we're talking about. And so
Exactly.
you can have, if you create an environment where you have all these different people groups represented, let's say, and you don't create an environment for them, you create an environment of compliance, and you don't create an environment of creativity and open discussion, then you're still not going to get the benefit of diversity in the conversation and in the innovation, the solutions that you provide. And so I love what you are. I love what you're talking about here. I want to do a plug right now, actually, for your book, Grappling with the Gray. And of course, you have other books as well. Proverbial Beauty is another one that you sent me, which is excellent. So, with this one, Grappling with the Gray, an ethical handbook for personal success and business prosperity. And again, I think about the different, I mean, it's just full of all of these case studies, practical, tough, not the lightweight stuff that's easy, we can make a decision on, easy to know the difference between one or the other solution, but literally some that you go, that's tough. Like, I don't know, how would I do that? And I love your approach of teaching through stories, teaching through parables, as you start to unpack in proverbial beauty, the reason why that is important. But teaching through these parables so that we can understand the concepts, the principles that are behind the scenes. So I would encourage everyone who is listening and watching, go get a copy of Grappling with the Gray. Excellent, excellent
Thank
book
you.
by
Thank you.
Yonason
And
Goldson. Yes.
when you mentioned storytelling, that certainly is a Jewish tradition, and that's the basis of the Book of Proverbs, which is what proverbial beauty is about. But I saw a study a few years ago that demonstrated that people who read literary fiction demonstrate more moral and ethical sensitivity than people who read nonfiction.
Interesting.
Because, yeah, it really is. But it's not hard to understand because our minds do not grasp facts out of context. I mean, we've probably all sat through presentations where slide after slide after slide of bullet points and all this information, all this data, and when it's over, I can't remember a single thing that was said because nothing was said with any context. Whereas if you create a story that communicates the idea, people will remember the story. And if they remember the story, there's a much better chance they're going to remember the lesson that is taught by that story, the meta story, the one that's really important for us to take away. And so, whether you're reading Harry Potter or you're reading Shakespeare, Jordan Peterson talks about Dostoevsky. He thinks Dostoevsky is the greatest writer in history. And he says what's so great about Dostoevsky is that he creates characters to present the point of view that he's against. But he makes them have the most powerful arguments because it forces the reader to take their point of view seriously. And only then can I really sink my teeth into, well, what is the counter argument? Why isn't that position correct? Why shouldn't I go with that point of view? And now I finish the story, and I'm a much more thoughtful, deeply thoughtful person because I've had the opportunity to look at an issue from both sides, really flesh it out, and come away with a clarity that I never would have achieved otherwise.
So good. So good. I wanted to also share a comment from Edith. She said, good decisions. Yes, Edith. This has been really, really good. Yonason, thank you so much for this. I mean, there's so much here that we could unpack, and this is just kind of scratching the surface. I would encourage our listeners and our viewers to take some of what you've heard here today. Obviously, as I mentioned before, go get a copy of the book Grappling with Gray, his latest book. There's also 5 other books that he's written as well that are excellent. And what you just finished off with there, this idea of the other person's point of view, I remember what you were saying when we first started talking about doing this interview. And you mentioned about like literally writing an essay. If you're going to do, you're taking your position. If you were to write an essay about the opponent's, the other side's point of view, how much different you would see the whole picture. And I think if we would just do that, if we would all just sit down and recognize which camp we're in, right? Recognize our point of view, acknowledge it, and say, okay, I know my point of view. I'm clear on that. Now, I'm going to take the other side's point of view and I'm going to make an argument for it. And take some time to do that. I think it will help us to find that point of agreement, to realize that we're actually, to your point earlier, we're actually all looking for the same thing. It's how we get there that we disagree on. But ultimately, I mean, I believe that every single person on the planet really wants to love and be loved. They want to be successful, whatever that looks like to them, and they want to have a great life for themselves and the ones that they care about. Now, how we get there is a different story. We all have different ways and approaches. But we can talk about that once we recognize, and you mentioned this earlier as well, in a team, you've got to have the clear mission. You got to know where are we going with this? What's the outcome and agree on the outcome. Then you can figure out how you actually get there. And the more diverse opinions and solutions and looking at the facts give you a greater opportunity to be able to do that and to achieve the goal that you're looking to achieve. So with that,
this is not a new idea.
Yeah.
Trial lawyers, they will make the case for the other side as preparation for their own case, trying to
Yes.
anticipate every possible argument. Legislators will do it when they're arguing a case in front of Congress.
Totally.
Anticipate how are our opponents going to try to prevent this legislation from going through. So it's just good sense to do it.
Yeah, otherwise they get blindsided because we hadn't thought of that. Well, the reason why you hadn't thought of that is because you hadn't thought of that.
Exactly. But also the point you made that people want to be good, people want to do good, and I think that's overwhelmingly true. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say everybody, but we have to be willing to surround ourselves with people who have those ideals, those genuine ideals, because the media thrives on making it look as if we're living in a society at war. That's how they get viewers. They come up with these salacious headlines. They come up with these, if it bleeds, it leads. And perception drives reality. So if we consume too many of these headlines, then we start to believe that there really is no hope, that there really can be no compromise. And that's what's really scary to me, is that most of us want things to be better and get better. And yet, you mentioned this before, the culture is designed to drive us apart. And I have to start with myself, not allowing myself to indulge that type of thinking, that type of worldview, and then to find people to associate with who are balanced, who have intellectual integrity, who are willing to look at both sides, who are willing to see how can we make things better. And I think that if more and more of us commit ourselves to that mission and that vision, that we can create a groundswell. We can build a grassroots movement, and we can take back our society.
Absolutely. Perception is everything. So that's good. One last comment from Byron. He says, people remember stories, not bullet points. That's a golden nugget. So awesome. Thank you for watching, Byron. And thank you all for watching. And thank you for your perspective, Yonason, for, you know, even like I think about some of the, again, I come back to your book and I come back to some of the ways that you even talk about in the book, that your solutions and how you approached it. When you unpacked it, I thought, yeah, that makes sense. But there were some times where I maybe disagreed with some of it, that it wasn't as difficult as it seemed to be to make that decision. Why is this decision so hard for this person to make? It's really not that hard. And yet, when we understand that when you're in the moment, sometimes these decisions are difficult. And we have right now, currently, we have some difficult decisions to make. And I think there's also inherent in this is compassion for people making those decisions and making them from the perspective that they have, the information that they have, which is leading to the decisions that they're making. And so I just encourage our listeners and our viewers to maybe go back and re-listen to this, get a copy of Yonason's books, and start to think differently, change your perspective, start looking at the other side, and start having some compassion. Hello, that'd be nice. Let's have some compassion for other people's point of view. Even if you don't agree with it, you can still entertain it. You can still acknowledge that what they say is true for them in that moment. And then you can have an opportunity to have a further conversation. People tend not to like it when you argue with them. And I'm saying is argue in terms of resisting, right? And discounting them. But when you can debate and you can invite them into a conversation, knowing that they will be acknowledged for their point of view, I think that will go a long way into starting to create some more unity and some more better solutions, more synergy, and I think everything will work a lot better. So with that, thank you again for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We appreciate you being here. Of course, you can go to tell them how they can reach you. We talk about your book. So your website, yonasongoldson.com. But you also have a lot more. Everything's there, but you're on social. Tell them a little bit more about where's the best place they can go if they want more information about what you're up to.
I'm very active on LinkedIn.
Okay.
That's where I spend most of my time online. It's a wonderful community, and there's just so much opportunity to engage people who are really people of quality and people who have good ideas and sound thinking. So please look me up on LinkedIn, Yonason Goldson, and reach out. I'm always happy to continue the conversation there.
Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you. And again, thank you for watching. Tune in next week. We have another amazing guest interview. We're going to be talking with Adam Gray, who is the co-founder of DLA Ignite. So we'll be talking about social media, business, and digital transformation. So I encourage you to do that. Also, I would encourage you to go to theleadersoftrandsformation.com. This is episode 392, which means that we have 391 other episodes of amazing guests on this show that are thinking differently. Some of them you're going to agree with, some of them you might not agree with, but you'll be able to gain a different perspective from listening to them. And so I encourage you to go to leadersoftrandsformation.com, check that out. We also have additional resources. I mentioned them in the beginning. If you're looking for coaching, reach out to me, schedule a consult. We'll have a conversation talking about how to grow your business, how to take your level of leadership to the next level. So again, thank you for being here. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon. Bye-bye.